Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jaylani Hussein, Executive Director of CARE Minnesota. We have a virtual event talking about the Countering Violence Extremism program, pre and during and post-Trump conversation with national expert and someone who we thank a lot for the work that he has done, Mike German. Mike German is a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice, Liberty, and a National Security Program, which seeks to ensure that the U.S. government respects human rights and fundamental freedoms in conducting the fight against terrorism. He's a former special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. His work focused on law enforcement and intelligence oversight and reform. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Mike served as a policy counsel for the National Security and Privacy for the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, Washington Legislative Office. Mike is also a recent author of the Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide: How the FBI Damages Democracy. The book chronicles how the FBI transformed itself after 9/11 attacks, which we right now just remembered 20 years of that, post 9/11, from law enforcement agencies famously for prosecuting organized crime, corruption, and arguably the most secretive domestic intelligence agency the country has ever seen. He's a 60-year veteran of the FBI as a special agent, where he specializes in domestic terrorism and covert operations. He left the FBI in 2004 after reporting continuing deficiencies in the FBI counterterrorism operations to Congress. Mike served as the adjunct professor of law enforcement and terrorism at the National Defense University. It is great to have you, Mike. You've been to Minnesota multiple times. You've been one of the few people that we rely on and has been a powerful voice against government programs internally and externally that impact community. And for those who are joining us today, I hope you can share and reshare the event so others can join us and be able to participate. This topic is exceptionally important to Minnesota. Many people in the last, I would say, 5 years or 4 years may have not considered this issue a priority or have seen it being played out publicly. But countering violence extremism was something unique here in the 8 years of the Obama administration. And most importantly, it is a policy that we saw immediately after the election of President Trump. The national view on it completely changed. So with further ado, I want to just start off with Mike. Thank you for joining us. We thank the Brennan Center and everyone who's been able to support these types of efforts and programs. Can you kind of explain a little bit for folks who are new to this? It seems like we have an insomnia of what's been happening around this policy. Can you give us a lay of the land, particularly pre the Trump era? And a little bit of that history and what is this program, what is the goal, and what are people trying to do?
Thanks very much, Jaylani. Thanks for having me for this webinar and also for hosting me at several previous events out there in Minneapolis back when we could all travel and get together. And I also want to thank you and CARE Minnesota for being just incredible partners and really developing the resistance to this program. You know, this concept of countering violent extremism is very insidious because it morphs into different iterations of itself. It's run by different organizations. Some are run by the U.S. Attorney's Office at the Justice Department. Some are run by the FBI. Some are run by the Department of Homeland Security. And often they change names. So, you know, CARE Minnesota, I think, did an excellent job, not just on the ground in Minnesota, helping the community understand the concerns about this program, but also sharing your knowledge with other cities that were experiencing parallel programs. You know, my concerns with the Countering Violent Extremism program developed very early. In fact, even while I was still in the FBI, you know, this concept of counter-radicalization and the theory that the government uses about terrorism radicalization is based on a flawed premise. and it's used by governments. Basically, the radicalization theory suggests that when there is some kind of political violence, what we today call terrorism, the problem isn't the limited number of people who are engaging in violence, but rather people who are spreading dangerous ideas that the government says lead to the violence. So they will argue in these radicalization models that people develop are exposed to a bad idea. They develop an affinity for that idea. They start acting as a political activist, spreading that idea, and then they become a terrorist. And that empirically is not true. I worked counterterrorism as an FBI agent, including undercover operations in neo-Nazi and far-right militant groups. And we know from academic studies of terrorists that that isn't true. But governments embrace this concept because it empowers their surveillance tactics and allows them to target political opposition rather than focus on the small number of people who are actually engaged in violence, and make sure that the violence is the focus of their concerns writ large, rather than just by people they see as political opponents. So, you have to understand from the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover cut his teeth in the FBI in the radicals division that he ran, that back in the early part of the 20th century engaged in the same kind of abusive surveillance, selective prosecution, and aggressive enforcement actions that targeted immigrants, that targeted trade unionists, that targeted civil rights activists. And again, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, through a program called COINTELPRO that many of you have probably heard of, that targeted civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King and anti-war activists during the Vietnam War. And that was, in name, a counter-radicalization program. The idea was they would target these radical voices that were seeking social change rather than targeting anybody who was engaging in criminal activity. So when this language was resurrected after 9/11, even while still in the FBI, I became very concerned about what kind of policies that would lead to. And very quickly, when the counterterrorism establishment in the FBI and the other intelligence agencies during the Bush administration started using this term counter-radicalization, that rang troubling in many people's ears because of the connection to COINTELPRO and the abuse of civil liberties and civil rights activists like Martin Luther King. So they abandoned the name radicalization and substituted it with violent extremism. But they intended that phrase to mean the same thing. This idea that it's not the violence that is the problem, it's the extremism that's the problem. And therefore, it justified mass surveillance, surveillance of communications, surveillance of associations. And that we saw as a problem, and resisted that while I was still at the ACLU, resisted those efforts to create a counter-radicalization program during the Bush administration. So when the Obama administration came in, they appeared to be much more attentive to civil rights concerns. But when we met with them on these issues, they were very resistant to the concerns that we were raising. And in 2014, they actually created this concept of countering violent extremism and identified 3 cities as pilot programs for the U.S. Attorney's Office: Minneapolis, Boston, and Los Angeles. But it was interesting the way they worded it, because what they said was, the reason we're choosing these cities is because they already have countering violent extremism programs that are effective. So again, it reinforced this idea that this isn't a program that they're creating from scratch. This is something that they're already doing. And what we saw in these programs is, they're very much similar to what the old COINTELPRO program was, where it's about identifying a suspect community, seeding that community with informants, and then requiring the community to divide it between the good people who will join with the government in trying to find the bad people, and the bad people who, in the government's view, who resist this government programming. So if you're willing to come in and parrot government programming, you become one of the good ones in the suspect community, but you're still part of the suspect community, right? Your value to the government is as an information source for the government to hear about the others in the suspect community who were following what the government alleged was radicalization. So unfortunately, yeah, it was interesting because during the Bush administration, rarely would government officials meet with us at the ACLU. When the Obama administration came in, they would meet with us often, but our appeals would fall on deaf ears. And when they would make changes or adjustments to programs, they were normally pro forma, changing the name of a program, not calling it countering radicalization, calling it countering violent extremism. And you know, we can talk specifically about Minnesota, where when Jaylani and CARE Minnesota invited me out for the very first time, when the U.S. Attorney Andrew Lugar had a program, he called me to ask me to not criticize his program. And I explained that his program was just starting. I didn't know, but that he should meet with the community. You know, it's not, I was living in New York at the time, that it's the community. If this is supposed to be a community program, he needs to engage with the community. So Jaylani and some others from the community came with me to a meeting. But the only thing that came out of it was changing the name from countering violent extremism to building community resilience. But the programming was exactly the same. So that's the kind of way that they would, you know, rather than addressing your concerns, they would try to paper over them with some cosmetic change that actually didn't do anything different. And it was very divisive in the community, with some members of the community, you know, wanting to cooperate with the government, thought that was the better way to relieve some of the surveillance pressure and other kinds of pressures that the FBI and DHS were putting on Muslim community members, particularly in the Somali community. But, you know, it was always interesting to be in those meetings because, you know, they would say, we want to build a better relationship with the community. And somebody would stand up and say, hey, you know, every time I travel, I get hassled at the airport. What can you do about it? And they would say, oh, that's not the purpose of this meeting. You know, you'll have to go to, you know, TSA redress programs. That's not what we're going to talk about today. It's like, okay, what are we going to talk about? You know, the community is also concerned about, you know, policing issues where people are being stopped and frisked or harassed, or there's unsolved murders in the community. I remember that was one of the big issues in Minneapolis. And they would say, no, 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 we're not here to talk about those issues. And it's like, well, what are we here to talk about? We're here to talk about terrorists within the community. How are you going to address the terrorists within your community? And of course, that, you know, if anybody knew that there was somebody harming somebody in the community, of course, they would want to address those concerns, but they weren't looking for terrorists. They were looking for people who were expressing ideas the government was not happy with. And particularly if those ideas were opposition to countering violent extremism, right? So it was this strange program where the government is coming in saying, we're going to do something for your community. And the community saying, no, 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 we want something different. And then the government saying, well, now we've identified the suspects are the people who are resisting this counterterrorism narrative that we're pushing. And, you know, so it was highly problematic. And unfortunately, both the administration and some people in the public who supported the administration didn't want to criticize that element of the programming. And then,
yeah, that's a lot of a quick synopsis. And as you mentioned, the Minnesota program and at the time U.S. Attorney Andrew Lugar, who is likely to return, as some reports have come out. One of the challenges to this particular issue has been on the ground that communities were concerned about their children joining terrorist organization, that they're panicked about it, and they were concerned about it. They wanted to, and the concern wasn't that the law enforcement, it was also the concern that, you know, this radicalization and this was happening, and many of these young people who may have been caught up into this were actually victims of online predatory and online targeting. And it was sad to see that in Minnesota, while this program was going on, how discretion and decision making by a U.S. attorney impacts the cases. You know, you had a similar case in Minnesota. You have 11 young people arrested through an informant who's literally forcing them to say the things that he needs to say to be able to hold them into this box of punishment. But in the same case, you have 3 young girls in Colorado that literally go and are stopped in Germany, and the U.S. attorney in Colorado sees them as victims of targeting. But in Minneapolis, because obviously there's also men, they're seen as hard criminals, which speaks to this issue about you know, Minnesota having a very large immigrant population, predominantly East African immigrants, Black, and that, you know, it's easier to label a criminal when, you know, the person is more than likely is Black, the person is more likely brown, the person is more likely immigrant, and it's easier to get away with that kind of targeting. And but going back stepping back and talking about I guess the end of the Obama era, here's this program. You have places like Minnesota and Los Angeles and other places, and it's also even Colorado, where they were pushing these programs. One, it was not only ineffective, it was interesting that these programs that they recommended really had nothing to do with even stopping radicalization. So apparently if you voted, you didn't become radicalized. It was just like they didn't really have a plan of what they were doing. They just wanted to create this effort to do surveillance. And we'll kind of tail back a little bit at the end about this groundbreaking whistleblower from Minnesota, the FBI agent who had this incredible story outlined in the New York Times Magazine. But if we look, if you can just maybe, why is it that during the Obama administration, it was so hard to tell people that this was problematic, and then immediately at that transition to the Trump era, everyone who was supporting these programs, even here in Minnesota, who had checks written out for them to do these programs by the Obama administration, who they stood next to them, all of a sudden didn't want to do it. What was the shift change? It was the same program. It wasn't fundamentally changed yet, right? So can you talk a little bit about that transition to the Trump years and kind of what changed?
Sure. You know, and I think, again, that's one of the insidious parts of this program, is that it frames itself as something to help the community, right? Mm-hmm. Building community resilience. Who would be against building community resilience? You know, and as you said, it's not as if there wasn't an issue. You know, there certainly was an issue with young people being caught up, and you know, like any other conflict, you know, the nation's a land of immigrants. You know, when I was growing up, there were troubles in Northern Ireland, and even though I'm only a quarter Irish, you know, I felt a pull that, oh, you know, somebody should be doing something there.
So are you saying you did not participate in the tip jar for the IRA that was at every bar in the country?
Exactly. You know, when this whole concept of material support for terrorism started, I was talking to a police audience, and I said, you know, show me the hands who contributed to NORAID. And you saw a bunch of heads going down, right? You know, that we've reframed the way we look at conflict to divide it into the good guys and the bad guys, right? This is a conflict in whatever country, and we're going to say, as a government, one side is terrorist. even though the methods that both sides use are horrible human rights violations, that it's this weird choosing. So if you happen to be a family who came from a region where the government is now saying, oh, the people who control that territory are terrorists and put on the foreign terrorist organization list, sending money to your family might put you in trouble with the government. So part of it is the Countering Violent Extremism program fits over a very problematic counterterrorism structure, and that's part of the problem. And you know, so the FBI is engaged in counterterrorism measures, like you mentioned, putting informants in the community who are trying to encourage young people to engage in some kind of act. So they don't need a terrorist recruiter. They're using government agents to recruit people into these criminal acts just for the purpose of arresting them. So you have that going on. So I can understand why people in the community wanted there to be some kind of space in between. You know, that I want to work with the government so they don't do that. I want to work with the government so that if somebody in the community is on some list that gets them stopped at the airport every day, that we can work with authorities to get them off the list. You know, I want to work with the government. So I think that was a lot of pressure to participate, with the idea that if we participate, we can form a better outcome. If we just refuse to participate, they're going to do all these bad things anyway, so it's not helpful. So I think that there was, you know, again, because the Obama administration would meet with people and would meet with the community, there was a feeling like you had some purchase. Mm-hmm. But they, again, didn't realize that the program was really about dividing the community that way. That's what counter-radicalization teaches, right? Make the community separate itself, you know, into good and bad, those pro-government and those who are resisting government, even if they're just resisting government policy. And it was, again, so the FBI has its programs. Department of Homeland Security also has its CVE programs, and its programs were grants to communities. And again, you know, these are communities that need money and need government support. So I can understand why groups wanted to take advantage of the money. And, you know, even in some private conversations around the country, they would say, look, if we get the money, we can use it for good purposes. We'll not do what they want us to do as far as giving them lists of people or doing, you know, finding the radicals within the community and reporting them. But I think when Trump came in, and of course, you know, he put the racism out loud and you know, immediately had the Muslim ban and you know, was very expressive in how racist his policies were going to be. So I think a light bulb went off that, you know, just because the president changes, the FBI, the Department of Justice, you know, these organizations are not changing. And now you have them openly expressing their racist intent. Okay, we saw a separation from those programs, and many of the community groups, even some that had accepted grants, refused them. And you saw greater resistance from the community once they realized how, you know, almost like the curtain was pulled back. You know, they were able to just look at the rhetoric from the Obama administration and say, oh, we can trust them. And once you have leadership that is not trustworthy, you realize how bad the program is and how damaging it is. So the Trump program shifted to mostly supporting law enforcement, which is kind of what the programs were from the beginning. It was just encouraging communities to get on board with supporting law enforcement. And, you know, and I know I'm going long here, but let me just say, one of the ways that the government encouraged groups to participate is they presented it as an off-ramp. Right, that if somebody is on this so-called path to radicalization, if a parent is worried about their child, if a community member is worried about some colleague or friend in the community that is perhaps on a bad path, if you report them to the government can get them into a program to de-radicalize them or to take them off the path. They can get them mental health treatment. They can get them educational opportunities, job opportunities to try to dissuade them from going on a bad path. But the program never had that, right? There was never any effort or capability to do that. There wasn't a lot of funding for public health initiatives that people could get mental health care for free. Those things didn't materialize. What it really was an on-ramp where the community members would identify troubled people in the community that the FBI could then focus its gaze upon and perhaps send informants in to interact with that person to encourage them along. And we have cases in Arizona, for instance, where a teenager was having some mental health problems, and the FBI demanded that they go to a particular psychiatrist. So the parents cooperated and sent their child to that psychologist, not knowing all along that not just the psychiatrist, that the FBI was sending informants. So even if we can assume the psychiatrist was trying to help this young man, the informants were still trying to encourage him to do bad things. And ultimately that teenager, when he turned 18, was arrested for terrorism-related activities because the informants had encouraged these activities. So the idea of it being an off-ramp was simply a false notion. It was an on-ramp. This is a way that we get community members to inform on other community members so we can identify people who we can target for exploitation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, the surprise thing in Minnesota that we saw was nobody wanted to talk about CVE after Trump came in. It was like they did not make the mistakes. And it wasn't just the community members and the groups that were paid to do this work, but it was also the politicians. I remember sitting in front of politicians telling them how bad this program was and how problematic it was, how is it ineffective. The idea that it was creating this intervention that was going to solve the real problem. First of all, it wasn't. It was smoke and mirror, and it was another way to divide the community. And it did divide the community. It did create this internal division. I would say in Minnesota, one thing I'm extremely proud about is the youth, the Muslim youth that really stepped up, especially those in college and others who stepped up, who said, no, we're not going to accept this type of framing of our community. That we accept the notion that this program really had and the impact that it will have for a long time, which is really built on an Islamophobic trope that that by default a Muslim is a terrorist until proven not a terrorist. That all of our children are somehow going to be radicalized. And many things that involve that. And that was the challenge. It was, and we saw that. We saw immediately as this program was being pushed on the community that the bullying changed. That we saw bullying in particularly in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and other places where the students were bullying them on the basis that they were terrorists. I remember a young Muslim student at St. Cloud, one of the high schools, who was being bullied online from her school, being called, because she had crutches, a disabled ISIS member, and among other things. And another student in one of the southern part of this state, I believe, who was being targeted. Her picture just sitting down on the floor. Somebody took a picture and was sharing that, here's a terrorist plotting. So that this type of notion really had a wider impact on the Muslim community because of this framing. And I remember, and this was the thing that I have a hard time with, is that, and maybe you can dive into it, how is it possible the allies of the Muslims, the Democrats, are the ones that are guiltiest when it comes to this program? And I remember in Minnesota, at the time, Hillary Clinton was running to be president, and she came and gave her security speech in Minnesota. And in her message, she had an Islamophobic trope that most progressives did not even hear, which was this idea that we need to have this wonderful program that the U.S. Attorney is doing here with the Muslim community. And the reason why we need to have this program is because the Muslims know who the terrorists are. So if we don't work with the Muslims, somehow, you know, we are going to not tell you who the terrorists are. I mean, this kind of labeling an entire community as a community that has to police itself. Like, I have to go around every morning and say, Muhammad, don't do anything today. Like, I mean, it sounds stupid, but this was the notion that Hillary Clinton, and we can't call that Islamophobic. But however, we can call Trump's Muslim ban Islamophobic because he threw the word Muslim in there and banned us. But when you say Muslims know who the terrorists are, you're giving us this labeling that we're somehow not true to being who we are as Americans, just like anybody else. So can you talk a little bit about the framing that we live in today? Now we are in post-Trump world. There is this idea that we put the Democrats as the saviors. The Democrats are the ones that kind of, but people don't see, I guess, the problematic aspects of the program like this through that lens of the progressive politics.
That's exactly right. And again, another one of the most problematic aspects of the program is it does focus on children, right? That these CVE programs specifically have programs for children. You know, the FBI, which doesn't have a juvenile program, right? There's no juvenile justice system within the FBI, within the federal government. You know, the federal government needs to take care of serious criminals who are adults. What we saw was the FBI setting up this website to lure kids into playing a game that was then explaining to them what ideas were dangerous and what ideas weren't. And it equated, you know, somebody who's an animal rights activist with somebody who's a white supremacist racist, you know, in this program that it really has nothing, that the FBI had no reason to be participating. It's called Don't Be.
And you can talk about the Don't Be Puppet that they were doing, the teaching that they were doing to.
Right. And it still exists. There's a website where they encourage teachers to give it to school children, young children. I mean, this is developed for, I don't think any high school kids would play this game even. This is really young children. And they encourage teachers to let children play a game on an FBI website that was supposed to frame how, you know, when they should go talk to the police about ideas that people had. The National Counterterrorism Center put out a whole checklist for teachers and social workers and health officials to go through. And it said things like rate on a 5-point scale if you're worried about this child, whether they have proper parent-child bonding. What does that have to do with anything? First of all, and what teacher is equipped to rate on a 5-point scale what a child's relationship with their parents are? I mean, it's kind of these absurd notions, but again, the whole idea of it was to cast a suspicious eye at the Muslim community and look at them as potential terrorists, looking for these, you know, slight behaviors that have nothing to do with actual terrorism, but were just a justification for applying special scrutiny to Muslim kids. So that was part of the problem. And, you know, with the concern about the rhetoric, you know, I remember at one point we had a conversation with the then Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, where, you know, they would talk about this as you know, some program that was necessary because there was terrorism committed by Muslims. And we would say, okay, but there's also terrorism committed by white people. Where's your white people CVE program? And he kind of threw up his hands and said, but Nazis would never meet with us. And it sort of highlighted how they think about this, where he said, no, Al-Qaeda doesn't meet with you at CVE meetings either. Neither does ISIS meet with you. You're meeting with the law-abiding Muslim community to talk about ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That would be like going to a white church of some sort and saying, tell us who the Ku Klux Klansmen are. You know, they have a cross on their uniform. They burn crosses. They're Christians, or they call themselves Christians. You must know who they are. Tell us who they are, right? Any white church would be horrified by that and very angry that their religion was being connected to this perversion of the religion. Yet somehow these government officials weren't able to see that they were applying that same logic to the Muslim community, and you know, creating this concept of collective guilt because, you know, a very small number of people perverted a belief system to suggest that it had something to do with the illegal acts that they were involved in. So, you know, that disconnect, unfortunately, I think is still prevalent certainly in the counterterrorism culture. And you know, unfortunately, because they have a powerful voice in government, you know, when the FBI or DHS rank and file or Department of Justice are saying what they need to policymakers, the policymakers feel like they can't resist that. So they have to go along with what these agencies say they need, even though, you know, we've seen a lot of the anti-Muslim training that the FBI and DHS were putting out around that time. So we know how bad and how racist that training was. And it didn't stop. You know, it's not as if the discovery prevented it from happening. You know, some of these Islamophobic instructors were still on the payroll going into the Trump administration.
Yeah, and to that point, Mike, you know, I think if we look at kind of now we're coming to post-Trump, we're in the Biden world. Everyone is still shocked that we have a new president, yet so many promises made on the campaign trail are completely ignored. Just yesterday, seeing those horrific pictures on the southern border with you know, immigrants from Haiti, a country that's been devastated by an earthquake. Many of those folks have been living in other parts of the South America, who really need some place. And we really dropped the ball with Haiti as well, and not really helping that country stabilize after a massive attack or earthquake. And you know, tremendous outpouring support from the American public, yet, you know, that country still is struggling. And then, you know, we see all of the other issues that have been happening in the country. We see the Afghan situation. Everywhere you go, you see the Biden administration really having to struggle, particularly telling the people that voted for this administration straight answers about what's going on and how do we do that. So speaking of that, knowing that Obama's administration and that legacy is carrying over to the Biden administration, where is this happening? And maybe before you answer that, one of the questions I wanted to specifically kind of nail down was, we saw a shift in how CVE transformed or morphed a little bit in the grants that we saw, that it started to target particularly Black activists during before even the killing of George Floyd. In the early days of the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw Black activists as becoming the second group beyond Muslims that were being targeted by these programs. Can you talk a little bit about that and then transition us to the Biden administration?
Sure. So you know, just like the COINTELPRO program moved from investigating, you know, Soviet spies in the United States and covert agents, communist agents from foreign countries, to American socialists, and then to American civil rights activists, right? That if your framing is that it's the ideas that are the problem, it's easy to move away from any actual criminal acts or acts of violence to these ideas. So it would, when a lot of the criticism that was obvious of the CVE programs is that they were exclusively focused on Muslim communities. So, you know, again, not listening to what the community was actually saying about the problems with these programs, they just tried to modify it by saying, oh, well, that's an easy fix. We'll just expand who we're targeting with these programs. Who else is agitating for social change? Oh, well, here's this new group, Black Lives Matter, that is criticizing government policy. I look at my radicalization checklist. Ah, that's one of the keys to radicalization is criticism of government policy. I'll look at Black Lives Matter too. And it expanded, and under the Trump administration, they changed the name to Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. You know, with this idea that, okay, we can resolve one of the criticisms of CVE by making it about more than Muslim terrorism and then even more than terrorism, and start targeting other groups that we think are challenging the government in a dangerous way. So Black Lives Matter became explicitly one of the target groups in these programs. As it transitioned to the Biden administration, initially they said that they were going to, examine the empirical value of these programs. And luckily they don't have to go far. David Shanzer of Duke University did an evaluation of the program and said it was not effective in its stated goals. It was causing more damage, and it wasn't effective in doing anything positive. So we already know these are ineffective programs, but rather than just ending it, they did another name change where now they call it CP3, which is, I always forget the 3 Ps, the Center for Prevention, Programs, and Partnerships. But the programming is still very much the same, except again, targeting broader audiences. And now that the public and the media are more focused on white supremacist violence and far-right militant violence, you're seeing the government use that as an excuse to expand the program even further. But the problem is the program itself is problematic. It's not designed to actually identify people who are doing harm, but people who are criticizing the government, and in doing so, taking their eyes away from people who are actually doing harm and putting them monitoring social media and doing other types of activities that aren't really effective when there are people actually hurting people in the streets and the police are looking the other way, right? And part of the reason that people were so violent at the Capitol on January 6th was because they were able to engage in violence all across the country for the previous 4 years at these rallies. So they were conditioned to believe the police would allow them to commit these acts of violence. And you could see on those videos that they were surprised and angry that a handful of officers were trying to prevent them from invading the Capitol and perhaps attacking members of Congress. So we have to understand how this program is doing damage to our communities, dividing communities, and understand that changing the name or adding an extra group into it just expands that danger and expands that division. And meanwhile, the community has real crime problems that they want the law enforcement to solve. And those problems get put in the corner while we're out here playing this predictive game with these silly checklists that we know from empirical analysis are not effective in identifying real threats.
I think that's a well played, well explained, and it's mind-boggling to some extent that we should at least learn something from failures. We should at least learn something, and the public, we are in a very hyper polarized and hyper fear-driven society. And also now, because of the polarization, we're getting to the point where, elected officials are wearing a face mask to get on a plane, but fighting it, right? And, this pandemic has extended the hallways of the hospitals to our homes and to our, public spaces. And a simple thing as wearing a mask or, getting vaccinated or just being smart about what you do seems to be so polarized. So that's one thing that I've been noticing, just when will the government get it right? And when will the public wake up and get out of this idea, this fundamental flaw that I think Jefferson talked about, which is this: we are becoming safer by, creating these labels and creating these programs and policies, when we all know that we just need the FBI and the law enforcement agencies to do where they get the most amount of ability to solve crime and to prevent crime, which is really going after credible threat. I mean, the Tennessee bomber, right? How can you miss that? How can you miss the young man who killed all of his classmates in Florida? How can you miss that when that data and that information is in your hands? And here in Minneapolis, we get at CARE Minnesota, we get almost about 100 cases a year of FBI visits that result in nothing, result in just literally having an attorney, and that's where it ends. And like, how is it our agencies are spending all of this amount of money and resources creating this perception that we are safer today, yet really creating this greater vulnerability when we actually have real credible dangers in amongst our community? The Tennessee bomber, the shootings that are happening in high schools and in public spaces, these murder-suicides that are happening every day, which is a terrorism at its best. The fact that the bombers of the Bloomington Mosque in 2017, who now, I think 2 weeks ago, were finally charged for this crime, they were known. They're going online, Mike, and they're putting out videos of them shooting mosques, and like little makeshift like, these people are telling you that they are a threat. And sadly, to learn about this particular case with the three individuals who drove from Illinois in the middle of the night, avoided tollways to avoid camera detection, and came and bombed the mosque, which we just learned also through this trial, the largest pipe bomb ever at least identified by the FBI. And the way that this case was broken was not an FBI bust. Right. It was because they started robbing Walmarts, and a local police officer was able to put one of them in the box, and he told everything else that they've done. And these guys have caused like havoc. They were literally going into Latin American homes, Latino homes, dressing as officers, wearing sheriff uniforms, trying to, get money or something. And they were doing this all over. And then finally, the only way we caught them is they start robbing Walmarts. And to show us that this infrastructure that we want them to do the right thing is focusing and putting all their energy on communities because of their identity. And then we are here to sit, as sad and as horrific September 11 was. It taught us a lesson that these agencies' egos got in the way of doing good law enforcement work. And now we're in another position where we are creating this essence that we're safer. We're not. There's another bomber somewhere that the FBI knows about that could bomb another downtown. He's an old white guy somewhere, but they're not going to go after him. They rather go after a Muslim young student and knock on his door. So can you tell, this is the big issue about this policy and this issue that we're discussing. Can you identify that, focusing on real hard criminality is what we want law enforcement to do, not this harassment and targeting and profiling that's happening every day?
Right. And, part of the problem is the way law enforcement is being trained. So often when there's some kind of law enforcement abuse, the policymaker response is, well, require more training, require retraining. And people aren't looking at the actual training, where the training itself is the problem. And, certainly the counterterrorism training that presented Arab and Muslim as backward and inherently violent that we saw, somebody who would never consider themselves racist or biased in any way is being trained to view the Muslim community as suspect. So once you're being trained that way, the way immigration was presented as a national security threat rather than as a benefit to our country, right? It's better that we have people when we're involved in conflicts abroad who understand the culture, who understand the language of the countries that we have problems with, so that we can better establish policies. But instead, our customs and border protection officials are trained with, if you let somebody come in, that might be a terrorist that does some kind of damage. So we have to treat any migration as a national security threat. And that's why you saw this militarization of the border. Well, guess what that does is white supremacists don't like Muslims and Arabs and people from Africa either. And so now you're putting law enforcement in the same intellectual space and often in the same physical spaces at these rallies with white supremacists. The far-right militias were very effective in reframing themselves as border militias. And they would go down where they're no longer anti-government. They're working with Border Patrol. They're an adjunct to Border Patrol. They're protecting our nation by harassing immigrants and threatening them and using violence against them. And, that marriage of these groups with law enforcement, it was perfected under President Trump, where he actually appealed to both of those audiences to be part of his supporters. And that's why you saw so many people in law enforcement involved in the assault on the Capitol. And that problem is enormous. That's something that law enforcement doesn't want to acknowledge is part of the problem, because when they see far-right militants attacking people in their community, if they're intellectually and ideologically affiliated with those groups, it's harder to see that as a threat to society. So that's why we see these far-right militant groups being allowed to travel around the country, engaging in violence. And, even in Minnesota, where the President Trump and many of the locals were blaming Antifa and Black Lives Matter activists. It turns out some of the most serious violence was committed by far-right militants, Boogaloo Boys and others who were there instigating the violence. But because the law enforcement was so focused on finding Antifa, they didn't understand what was actually going on. And of course, the frustrating thing to me is
also, you just mentioned that, this relationship, right? This relationship of we're the ones we care about our law enforcement. We support our law enforcement. We stand with our law enforcement. But on January 6th, they killed law enforcement, right? So,
and all along have. That was the frustrating thing to me is I would, I get the opportunity to speak to law enforcement audiences, and I would show them, Boogaloo Boys killed 2 DHS officers in Oakland. They killed a sheriff's deputy in California. They kill police officers just because they wear the Blue Lives Matter patch. Doesn't mean they like you. They're just trying to side with authorities so they can engage in the violence without being policed. And if you're not, and you mentioned COVID, and this is, think of all the resources and equipment that presidents or that police officers demand because they might be threatened by violent criminals, right? From, the high capacity weaponry to bulletproof vests and the authorities they demand, right? Because they're putting themselves in this dangerous position, they have to have immunity when they act, because you have to be on their side when they have to make a split-second decision based on their fear rather than any objective threat. But what kills police officers now? COVID kills police officers now, right? Statistics are still coming out, but roughly twice the number of deaths from COVID among the law enforcement community than any other on-duty cause of death. And yet you see law enforcement is often leading the anti-mask charge, leading the opposition to vaccine mandates, even though it's killing them. And that's what has concerned me, is that this framing of radicalization has so twisted the ideology of law enforcement, that they can no longer objectively view the evidence of threats because they have this fake checklist that is checking things that they're opposed to, right? If I'm looking,
yeah, I see it as you're identifying. I see it as the alliance of these white mobs, pretty much the post Tea Party, that were created and all of a sudden attach themselves to these law enforcement agencies, and then they're the ones, as you said, they're the ones carrying not only the booglers but also these mom and pop groups that are forming that we stand with the the blue line. And I've seen it the same in Minnesota. It was interesting. We had our own January 6th event that nobody wants to talk about here in Minnesota. We actually literally had 6 Republican Minnesota legislators at the Capitol in Minnesota standing next to these people, and who were calling for a civil war, who were cheering on once they learned that the Capitol was sieged, and were shouting and were also threatening. They just didn't have enough people to go in to the Minnesota State Capitol, but they also threatened the children of the governor. And according to the news articles, this was the first time ever the governor had to evacuate his family out of the mansion, right? Nobody wants to talk about this. And I'm starting to see these same groups. And it was interesting, by the way, these groups, they don't just show up. It's the most awkward thing I've seen, especially after the uprising in Minnesota with the killing and murder of George Floyd. You see these groups show up, they protest, and the leaders are these people who have been organized right around the election of Obama. They're well organized. They've been anti-Muslim. They're Islamophobic. And these rallies where people are supporting the police, and they're not, the rest of the people don't even know what, they're only there to support the police against, obviously, the community that's calling out for transformative changes. And in that speech, they just throw in anti-Muslim stuff. Oh, we have to stop Sharia. And I could just see, as the video and the Facebook, I watch them, the people are like, oh, I don't know what that is, but apparently we're with it too. So right. This alignment of that's happening, where even the police departments are like, hey, I have people that are supporting me. I'm not going to shun them. But then those same people, as you just said, are also saying, we're not going to wear these masks, and are using Islamophobic and anti-Semitic language to saying, well, now we're being treated like the Nazis, or they're forcing us to wear the hijab because that's what the mask is about. So this alliance I've seen in the back end, where now the police officers and police associations are literally attached. Now there's these pro rallies where you see all types of anti-American and also what I would call dangerous type of alliance that's happening. And then it's acceptable now. And we saw it, manifest itself on January 6th.
Right. And you make an excellent point there, because so much attention is focused on the January 6th riot without recognizing that this far-right violence has been occurring across the country before January 6th and after. 2 weeks before the assault on the Capitol, far-right militants attacked the Oregon state legislature. Yep. They breached the doors, they broke windows, they fought with police officers, and they beat up journalists. It was a smaller version of what happened at the Capitol 2 weeks later, which raises 2 questions. One,
and the Michigan threat against the governor.
Exactly. So,
and legislators.
Yeah. In the Oregon situation, a state legislator who was in the building had cooperated with the militants to let them in, to send him a text message, and he would come down and open a side door to let them in. And he's since been charged with that and expelled from the legislature. But it shows how, again, in this counterterrorism framing, the government wants to look at challenges to government policy, the same as white supremacists and far-right militant violence, arguing they're extremists, right? These are people on the margin of our society, without recognizing that white supremacy and far-right militancy is very different. There are people in elected offices who have run on openly racist campaigns, right? That this is something more foundational to our country. and more deeply embedded in every aspect of our society. And we can't treat it as just a few people on the margins of our society. We have to understand how it manifests itself throughout the criminal justice system, to be sure, but also in our schools, often in our public health systems. I mean, it's not surprising that Black and brown people are feeling the brunt of the public health issues arising from COVID. You know, that when you look at what the police aren't doing, right, that the unsolved homicide rates are much higher in Black and brown communities, that they're not, you know, it's not just that they're over policed as suspects, it's that they're underserved as victims of crime.
Yep.
So, you know, again, when it gets to this conversation about policing, it's, well, you know, you have to support the police because they protect us from crime. Well, that's not true in every community. And that's the part where, you know, because, again, you say we're so polarized, and I would argue that the government's radicalization theory and these CVE programs are part of that polarization, right? It's dividing everybody into the good Americans and the bad Americans, you know, the ones who are causing problems and the ones who support government programs. That's what counter-radicalization is all about, is that you secure your place in society by going along with the government. And if you challenge government policy, even peacefully, non-violently, then you are part of the problem. And you become not just a political opponent to the government, but framed as a security threat that deserves some kind of law enforcement surveillance and attention.
Shifting gears a little bit, we mentioned this earlier in the program, talking about the whistleblower from Minnesota, the FBI agent, Terry, and this New York Times article. Can you just kind of walk us through? I know a lot of people are in Minnesota are not even aware of this because the local press here have not even picked up on this, but he really talks about, you know, a career spanning right around the September 11, 2001. Something that I think he mentions, you know, most of the things that he mentioned is the things that we have been talking about, the abuses that we've been talking about, the poor training that you talked about, the training that literally creates bad FBI agents, and the policies behind it. And for folks who are interested, I'll put it in the chat, the link to the article. And can you tell us a little bit about, because this whole thing started with him literally sharing documents in an effort to educate us, you know, and he was charged with espionage charge instead of being welcomed as a whistleblower, someone who is trying to make the FBI better. In Minnesota, he's unique because he's been an agent. He's been involved in some other cases that we have been involved in. We represented clients that he was speaking to, you know, so there. Talk a little bit about his story, and I'm calling him, you know, the modern day police law enforcement hero. Those who speak very loud to tell us the failures that we need to speak very loud about, because they're critical to how we keep our nation safe and how do we hold law enforcement and government accountable.
Thanks very much for that. You know, I wrote a little bit about Terry Albury in my book, and that was before I'd actually met him or had any conversations with him, because he was in prison at the time. Terry was, like me, a longtime FBI agent who, the longer he was in the FBI, the more he started not just identifying the problems, but recognizing them as a pervasive part of the culture within the FBI, right? The FBI remains, to this day, a predominantly white male organization, which there's, you know, it's again one of the ways how structural racism still infects our society, that you have this very important law enforcement agency, the predominant law enforcement agency in the country, that it is resistant to any kind of diversification. So he purportedly was the only Black agent in Minneapolis. So when he's seeing these problems that look to him like the racist problems of the FBI's past in who gets targeted and where resources are being devoted for investigations and the things he's asked to do as far as going out and identifying people merely because they're immigrants for some kind of FBI scrutiny. There weren't really a lot of mentors he could go to who would understand that kind of criticism. And, I sympathize with him because that's exactly what I felt, a decade before, that, somebody has to do something. But the whistleblower system in the FBI is set up to suppress the information. So I believed in the system and I stayed within the system. But what that allowed is the management to target me for all kinds of selective investigations and took away my duties, right? That I wasn't able to do work anymore because I was criticizing the FBI's program. So he took a different tack and, really showed much more courage than I did, that he was willing to go to the press when I wasn't. What's frustrating about it is the documents he's accused of sharing with media are FBI policy documents, right? These weren't documents that somehow revealed some secretive methodology or revealed the names of informants or things like that. These were policy documents. These were the policies that we as Americans, our tax-paying dollars go to support the production of these policies and the implementation of these policies. So we have a right to know what the policies say. We have a right to know how the FBI interprets its authorities and how it puts those authorities into practice. And so, I'm not aware that anything that he is alleged to have provided to the media did any harm to any person at all. And yet the FBI prosecuted him and he spent 4 years for informing the public about policies and practices that the public had a right to know. So, I think recognizing how impervious the FBI is to internal criticism as well as external criticism is crucial. And we really have to know how the FBI interprets its authorities, and particularly as we're seeing deficiencies, right? I mean, kind of adjacent to our conversation, but there was just an Inspector General report about the sexual assaults of U.S. gymnasts and how the FBI didn't respond to those victims coming forward and explaining there was a problem. If we have a law enforcement agency that can pick and choose who it decides to investigate based on its own biases rather than actual evidence of wrongdoing, we're going to end up in multiple situations like this. And, unfortunately, because these white supremacist and far-right militant groups have become conditioned to believing that their violence is authorized by the government because the police don't stop them. And the FBI, when they come to, reporting indicates that at least 4 people who were Proud Boys, one of the far-right militant groups that led the assault on the Capitol, were FBI informants. So how is it that the FBI wasn't better prepared on January 6th? It's because they were viewing them as the good Americans who were fighting and Black Lives Matter activists who were the bad Americans in that, again, this division that comes from countering violent extremism.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for those, I put it in the chat. You can look at the article. The article is pretty extensive. It's a well written, and to Terry's credit, I think he's done an incredible service to all of us. And as you mentioned, yeah, and to many of those folks who may not know those documents that he shared, these documents were actually impacted real life people here in Minnesota. It impacted real people here when the FBI would work with the Border Protection and had a policy where they would just randomly, not randomly, they would literally share information, and people would be visited to be recruited to become informants based on those conversations that they had at the border, and among other things, and clear discrimination. And in this article, he also talks about the Countering Violence Extremism program. He talks about how it was used as a tool to inform the community, a tool of surveillance to some extent. And he also mentions in the conversations how FBI agents saw the Somali community, right? There's a comment in there where he mentions that one of the FBI agents was part of that task force for the U.S. attorney at the time, saying what we should do with the Somalis is blow up the Cedar Riverside towers. We see that again and again with law enforcement. We had a Minneapolis police officer who put it on social media that the looting should start here, start in looting and destroying this facility or these neighborhoods, right? And it's an eye-opening and I think a very powerful story, and someone again that should be right now working in the FBI to fix this mess, to be someone who is given that support, and someone who should be testifying to Congress and talking about some of these problematic aspects that not only violate the civil liberties of minorities, but fundamentally do not make us safer as a country, and make this entity, the FBI, less effective and more racist, which is exactly what's going on. I mean, the question, you saw his picture there with his classmates, and as Mike was talking about, like, I remember there was we were in a meeting with the FBI agents, or the FBI, and they were like, "Oh, we're looking to hire." I'm like, "Oh, okay. What are you hiring for?" And they're like, "Oh, we're hiring for a language specialist." And so is that the only thing you hire for? For people of color, you only hire for language specialists. You don't hire actual special agents, right? And that's, again, that framing that, the community is only a suspect, and we need them to help us identify the suspect, but they can't be part of the team that's actually looking for the suspect. Right. And that's a history for a lot of agencies. But I think for the FBI and perhaps even the CIA, some of these more clandestine agencies, not having that kind of diversity, which is critical, especially since they do a great deal of surveillance of people of color.
And there's no excuse for it. I mean, it was fascinating. The FBI Director Chris Wray was testifying earlier this year and was asked by a congressman about the lack of diversity within the FBI. And he said, and what he's doing about it. And he said, we're very excited because this year we have, a record amount of diversity in the applicant pool. And it's like, wait a minute, you've always had diverse applicants.
Right.
The problem is those applicants don't get appointed to positions as special agents, that it was a way to just divert the conversation and end it without actually addressing the problem. There are officers of color in all sorts of federal law enforcement agencies, whether it's DEA, whether it's ATF, whether it's the U.S. Marshals, who carry a federal badge based on the same or similar training than the FBI got. So if the FBI wanted to diversify, they could be diversified tomorrow. They just go to all those agencies and say, "Hey, you have a really good record as a DEA agent. How'd you like to be an FBI agent?"
Right.
We'll give you a bonus to come over and be an FBI agent because we need to diversify the FBI. Right? They could do that, and within a month, the agency would look like America. But they don't do that. They don't take measures. And of course, part of the problem, it's not just that there's a culling process that applicants of color have a difficulty getting through, and women, but once they're inside, they don't get treated very well either. And they raise concerns about internal discrimination like Terry did. The response is not, how do we help you, but rather, how do we protect the institution from this allegation? And so the person who is reporting discrimination becomes the enemy of the agency rather than recognizing that's the agency's best friend. And it's and this is beyond the FBI and all agencies. It's this odd situation where you're talking about internal discrimination within an agency where you have an employee accusing other employees of engaging in wrongdoing, and the agency naturally protects the people accused of wrongdoing and targets the person who's reporting the wrongdoing. It's confounding. They're both employees. They're both on your team. You should recognize that, hey, it's that person pointing out the problems that's actually the person we should be supporting and addressing the wrongdoing by the people they accuse.
Absolutely, absolutely. So before we close off, I wanted to get an opportunity to also ask you. You have this new book that's out now, and can you tell us a little bit of I guess the what you've tried to accomplish in this book, your experience, and what readers should be just excited to look forward to?
Thanks for that, Giovanni. The book is about how the FBI changed post 9/11 and how they resurrected many of the problematic policies and the language around those policies. But I particularly interviewed a number of FBI agents who had either reported internal discrimination or reported some other problems within the FBI and became the targets of abuse, to show that when we changed the FBI from predominantly a law enforcement agency charged with investigating violations of federal law into this concept of a domestic intelligence agency, that's extremely dangerous, where, again, the process is no longer who do I have evidence has done something wrong, but who do I think might cause problems in the future? And when you take a white male organization and ask them to speculate about who might be a threat in the future, they tend not to be afraid of people who look like them, people who have the same background as them. They tend to be afraid of people who are agitating for social change, who don't look like them, who don't have the same ideologies or histories. So that creating us and them within this institution has allowed them to target communities not based on evidence of wrongdoing, but just based on their bias, and then circle around and identify the enemies within the people they suspect as security threats within the FBI are people who are not white males, and they target people based on their race, ethnicity, or whistleblowers, people who are raising internal concerns because they become the enemy of the system. And to fix that, what you need to do, number one, is diversify the FBI very quickly, but also reestablish the FBI as a law enforcement agency, make them focus where there are actual violations of law, because we're very lucky in some ways. We're a relatively safe nation. We're much safer from criminal violence than we were even in the 1990s when I was joining the FBI. As much as counterterrorism became a focus after 9/11, we actually don't experience very much terrorism in the US, thankfully. But as we're prioritizing those issues, more serious crimes that actually occur are going unaddressed. And that, often is white supremacist violence. The FBI today can't tell you, because they don't collect data on how many people white supremacists kill. They don't know the answer to that question because they don't seek that data, because they don't prioritize those crimes.
And that is the latest information that they share, is this idea that white supremacists are the greatest threat right now. And then and even now with hate crimes, every year their report comes out and it's missing a SWAT of hate crimes. And this just the nature of, one thing I'm particularly concerned about, and which kind of came out of the what I would consider to be the the Facebook hearings was this notion that we are no longer a threat. The threat of organizing hate groups and white supremacist groups is now happening by, you know, the arch enemies of the United States, Russia and China and God knows who else, who are creating an entire movement online with real Americans who are at discord or polarized, and that, you know, your local home, you know, group that is a militia or somehow maybe thinking that they're speaking to somebody in another militia in another state, but really they're just speaking to some Russian operative or Chinese operative somewhere. You know, that, and that's the thing, that hate has become a weaponized tool that is going to create more white supremacists, but also potentially dangerous situations. And how easy it is that we are not only ignoring, but not even identifying the problem and addressing it directly. Do you have comments on kind of that?
Right. And exactly where, you know, what the FBI is asking for again, you know, that they have recognized the obvious now that, oh, it's actually white supremacists who are engaging in the most violence and the most deadly violence in the domestic terrorism category, and are responding to public criticism of their lack of attention to that violence. But instead of saying, okay, we're going to focus on that violence and investigate and prosecute the violence, they're saying we need more authority to monitor social media, where once they are given that authority, there's no requirement that they focus that on white supremacist violence, right? It's just, you know, that the law enforcement intelligence agencies are very effective at turning every failure into an opportunity for them to get more resources and more authorities. And rather than focusing on what is the real problem, the fact that they're not investigating white supremacist violence, instead they're using it as an opportunity to expand their suspicionless monitoring of our communications.
As we conclude, I want to thank you, Mike, and I want to just bring up, I know for those who this is kind of new and want to learn more, the Brennan Center put together really a good website with a lot of information, research that you've done, papers you've done. So I encourage all of you. I put the link in the chat so you can follow and learn more about the Counter Violence Extremism program, the different aspects of it, how it kind of transformed, and good resource that I recommend a lot of folks to just look into. Has data and explanations about these programs, and so I encourage all of folks to get in. And Mike and Faiz have been incredibly important and relied upon as kind of the leaders of this space, particularly with the Brennan Center. And so thank you for all the work that you do. And you know, I think for a lot of folks now, that post I would consider to be the after the killing and murder of George Floyd, there seems to be a great deal of more Americans, predominantly the majority of the country here, that are starting to wake up a little bit and starting to ask the hard questions and starting to recognize that we are not getting the full truth, and we really need to make sure that we create transformative public safety that does less harm. And you know, I think, you know, with the ending of the Afghan war and coming away with billions and trillions of dollars spent and nothing to show for significantly, and the rampant crisis and the million of people that we've killed now in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and the thousands of U.S. soldiers that have been killed, and the thousands who are injured, and the thousands who are suffering every single day today with PTSD, and the thousands who have lost opportunity with their family. And, you know, just thinking about these policies, what our government does to tell us the story of that they are doing public safety, but fail to uphold that aspect of public safety, not creating more harm in lieu. And so I think more people are waking up. I hope they can understand the CVE dynamics. And I appreciate and hopefully have you on again as we learn more about the Biden administration and its next alphabets of what they're going to call CPP now. They may come up with a new one. We don't know. But and just to also wake up a lot of the activists who don't even know that these programs exist and that they're problematic and all of that. So thank you, Mike. Thanks to the Brennan Center for doing this work always. And we hope to connect with you soon. And for the audience, feel free to share the video with others. We will hopefully be having more programs like this online. Please share your feedback as well always. And we look forward to it. With that, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jaylani.